Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 659th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Woody De Othello and the Rail's Managing Editor, Charles Schultz. I'm thrilled to welcome Poet Laureate and my colleague Raevan Aliyah Sr. here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from. And today it's my pleasure to introduce our guest and host. Miami-born, California-based artist Woody De Othello's subject matter spans household objects, bodily features, and the natural world. Everyday artifacts of the domestic tables, chairs, television remotes, telephone receivers, lamps, air purifiers are anthropomorphized in glazed ceramic, bronze, wood, and glass. Othello's sense of humor manifests across his work in visual puns and cartoonish figuration. And our host today is writer and editor Charles Schultz, who is managing editor of the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Chloe. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Woody for joining us. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you today. I got to go see two exhibitions that you were in, the solo exhibition at Karma and group show at the Metropolitan Museum, which had a whole lot of really interesting historical material involved. But before we talk about each of those shows, I just wanted to talk a little bit about your background and how you kind of got to be where you're at now. One of the things I learned about you doing a little bit of reading yesterday was that you had an early part of your an early part of your practice where you were showing work placing work in bodegas, barbershops, places like this. I'm just curious to hear like some stories about that, how that started, any kind of anecdotes that came out of those moments.
I think it was kind of like a natural progression of the studio practice. I was making a lot of figurative work, and I feel like in gallery settings, I was trying to like make installations. So like sourcing like thrifted items to kind of give or place the work in more of a context and give it more of a domestic feel. And somewhere along the line of that thinking and kind of just like the reality of just like circumstance, when I moved to California, I didn't have a car, so I couldn't go around and buy stuff. So I was just like, it's a lot of work to kind of accumulate all these objects. Instead, let me take the sculpture and kind of like try and photograph them in these different like places that already had these inherent qualities of being lived in. So yeah, there's a bodega I used to go to all the time that I lived at when I first moved to California, and I just had these sculptures, and I just asked them like, hey, can I put this sculpture here and take like some photographs of this sculpture? The same thing happened with like the barbershop. It was just like some place I used to get my hair cut. I was just like talking to him. It's like, yo, I'm an art student and I want to do this project here. Can I like bring this sculpture here? Can you like act like it's getting its hair cut? So that's kind of like the kind of like origin of that. But it's just like I was doing all these things to kind of give the work as much context as possible. And I don't know if you call it like just like trying to expedite that process a little bit and do less work. So yeah, that's kind of where that started.
It's funny you talk about giving the artwork a haircut. We did a feature with the great painter Rachel Yelena Williams. I don't know if you know her work, but she described also giving her work a haircut as one of the phases that she pushes her pieces through. But yeah, I really take a lot of heart from from the idea of making play with the artworks, you know, especially in places where there's not usually so much opportunity to engage with things that are so aesthetically oriented. Barbershops and bodegas also have so much visual character in and of themselves, and so much, you know, background. When you were like in these different rooms and areas, you know, there's so many different types of places. Whoa. Uh, where, thank you, Chloe, where I'm sure you could have selected to put your piece. And as Chloe brings up this thing, you know, it makes a really nice opportunity to talk about how much you've matured this idea of placing objects in an environment. But before we talk about the green room here, I'm curious a little bit more about like the bodega, perhaps, like how did you choose where? Did you base your choices on the light, or was there like other objects that were particular to you that wanted to like be in dialogue with the object?
It was kind of just like out of, I don't want to say out of opportunity, but like just like thinking about the work. I feel like, you know, when I first got to graduate school, I made this like fictitious like character. Their name was Patty, and I just made work about Patty, and I thought about the things that this character would do, and like shopping at a bodega, or like trying to go through some type of like self-care routine of like maintaining their like physical appearance was a part of their kind of like just like practice. So it wasn't like too over thought out. It was just like, I want to do this thing and let me see how it looks. I feel like, you know, that kind of like impetus is like still there in my work, where it's just like if I have the inclination to do something, I rather do that versus like trying to like justify it, or like kind of like make reason or sense out of it. I feel like too, like, I mean, I think one of like the David Hammond's piece with The Rock with their haircut that has like the kind of like really
Yeah,
tight cut
yeah.
fade was definitely a point of like reference and departure. I feel like, I don't know, like that had so many different elements to it. And I was like, yeah, obviously like inspired by that. So
Yeah, and yeah, Mark Bradford is a California artist, has such a history related to barbershops that it's like it's
mhm.
hard not to also think about that as certainly not something that was part of the phenomenon that you created. But like you said, with making art and with making anything, I think that is of value, once the situation has happened or the artwork has been created, it kind of has its own gravity, and the connections that it makes, that other people make to it, those things I think become myriad and multiplied based on, well, perhaps based on the integrity of the artwork itself. So, you know, I think this idea of exploring Patty, you know, and just kind of letting yourself be led by Patty without questioning what Patty, where Patty was going to take you. It seems like an intuitive and like natural process. But is that how is that sort of intuitive sort of foundation or base layer? Is that something you had to work towards, or is that something that was kind of a natural part of your disposition that you took with you to grad school?
I think that's something that like, you know, is kind of like has always innately been a part of me, but I feel like intuition is something that, you know, you have to work at, and like the more you work at it, the easier it kind of becomes. I had this conversation with Tony Marsh down at Cal State Long Beach like a couple like late August, and he said that, you know, intuition is like a muscle, and like the more you exercise it, the better you are at it. And I was like, yo, that is like one of the realest things that I have ever heard, you know. And it's just like that kind of thing. I think it's just like, it's like special, but it's not like obvious for us to always follow it. I feel like, you know, a lot of times like it's easier to kind of like not follow your gut, or not follow that first impulse, because like there's so many outside factors that are telling you otherwise. So I feel like it is like a specific trait and skill that, just like anything, like needs to get honed in on, and the more you exercise it, the easier it becomes to kind of like just like situate yourself in that manner. And I think it's becoming like a life philosophy. I'm like one of those type of people where like I kind of always go with my first choice for better or for worse, but like I feel like I'm much more interested in exploring the kind of like reasoning of why you're first initially so attracted to something or compelled to kind of like investigate something, you know, and then the logic and the reasoning comes after the fact. If there is something to be learned from it, sometimes you just do something and you're just like, yeah, I'm not doing that again, and that's valuable information as well.
I couldn't agree more. And the one thing I would add to that is reflection. Like intuition is something that you have to exercise in the present moment. You can't plan to do it. And I mean, perhaps you could say you could plan to set yourself up for intuitive opportunities at any time you go into the studio, or anytime I sit down to begin writing. You sort of have to open yourself up to the vulnerabilities of imagination, and I couldn't agree more that trying to figure that out in almost any phase is going to be regressive. But reflecting on them, I think, is also a necessary part of like honoring them. And as you were talking, I was also thinking about what it means to be intuitive at different speeds, and we were talking earlier about the different paces of New York, California, different paces that I see painters. Sometimes you can see the brushwork is very fast, and that there is an incredible amount of intuition and trust really happening. But also, so much memory and knowledge in the body that it's like the person who's making the choices, whether it's a painter, say race car driver, like the relationship of the person to the object that they're using, and I would maybe extend the metaphor and ask you this question to your clay and your kiln, about speed, acceleration, and intuition. Do things move quickly? Do things necessarily move slowly? Are there different moments where you find yourself at different paces? And if so, how does that affect the way that you make those types of choices?
I think clay is kind of like a lot of the points you're like beholden to what the clay is doing, and you have to take into account the environment. So I feel like during the summer, I need to work faster because there is more. It's hotter outside, and there's less moisture in the air. So it's just like I can't like wait to kind of make decisions. Things need to happen like super quick, unless before the clay just like completely dries out. And then during the winter, it's just like I can kind of take as long as I want to sculpt something because there's just so much humidity in the air. So I feel like, some of it I'm kind of just beholden to the material, but I think I'm just like thinking about like this show. This show came together pretty quick, just because of the timing of the year, making most of the work in the summer, and also just like having the time constraints. So sometimes, like a deadline like forces you to kind of be in a spot where you can't overthink things. You just have to like act and react and just kind of make the thing happen as quickly as possible. But I do think that there is this like longer fold where I'm able to make connections from like this like earlier like graduate school work and undergrad work to like the decisions that I'm making now, because like painting the walls of a space I've been doing a lot, just like in terms of like thinking about like exhibitions. I feel like I've been thinking about this idea of like more environments and how do you have more agency in the space for a while. And I think this show is just like, kind of like this progressional step of that. I think, with the sculptural forms too, I feel like, a lot of the forms I revisit, some of them happen really quick where I'm just like doing it and not thinking about it. And then I'm able to make connections. And like when I do have the space to process and reflect. So it happens at varying speeds. And, it's something I'm becoming more attuned to now, but I feel like the actual work happens like pretty quick. Like the individual objects, I think that happens like it doesn't happen too long, but collectively it becomes the shape of it becomes something else.
I hear what you're saying, and as you were talking, I was looking at the calendar on in the back of the picture here. I don't know, Chloe, if you can jump to the calendar, because my next question is I want to allude to your painting here and ask about drawing, and what sort of role, if any, does drawing have in the process for you?
Drawing. I've been drawing since as long as I can remember. I've been drawing since I was a kid, so it's always been like a way for me to communicate like emotionally and like mentally what's going on. It's also been a way for me to kind of like situate myself in different places, like just like making still life drawings and just like kind of like jotting down ideas. I feel like I have a pretty deep relationship to like just like communicating on paper in that way. I feel like I almost travel everywhere with my sketchbook. I like to have pen and paper around me so I can just like jot something down. Some of it is kind of like is almost like chaotic because I probably have like a dozen different sketchbooks that are just like quarter filled, halfway filled. I have one sketchbook that I keep around me, but like I feel like I draw a lot. But that stuff is more intimate, you know. It's more just for me to kind of communicate to myself and to kind of like verbalize things that are going on in my head and put them somewhere tangible. So yeah, and again, talking about this idea of like different speeds, like painting and drawing offer something different than the sculptural works. So sometimes I really do have a need to kind of like work something out in a couple of hours or in like a day or like 2 days where, you know, no matter how fast I want to work with the sculpture, I can't put something, or I mean, I have put stuff in the scope in the kiln soaking wet. But for the most part, it's just like I can't do that, you know, where with painting and drawing, there's this like immediacy um that is just like, I don't know, it satisfies a different part of just like my creative process and practice.
And it's interesting to me. I had no idea that it was something that was so deep in your biological history as well. Making drawings from such an early age. Um, I don't suppose, but your clay making hands. When did that start for you? Not a certain. And do you feel that your drawing hands have given your clay making hands sort of a, I don't know, a boost, or how do you, like, I guess, how do you think, or do you think that there's a fluidity or a fluency or a knowledge, I guess I'm kind of jumping for a word here, that crosses over from one to the other?
I think I understand what you're saying. I feel like it's a symbiotic relationship. Like they both inform each other. I feel like,
Yeah.
you know, in terms of like working with my hands, this is something I've been doing since I was a kid, you know, as well. I was always like the tincturing or like trying to like break something apart or try and put something back together. I feel like I used to make these like aluminum foil cities with like these figurines when I was like super young, and I would just like live out this like whole kind of like fantasy world with these like aluminum foil characters. And I remember my grandmother would always just throw them away because she didn't understand what I was doing, and I would be devastated, like building at like attachments to like, you know, these
Wow.
like little small forms. I feel like
Yeah.
that kind of like all translated into
Yeah.
like the clay making. But you know, I like, you know, I feel like just like making art and like using clay, it feels like something that my spirit and like has known for a long time. So it's almost like just like this innate relationship that's just like, it feels like it's been there for I don't know, for like I don't know, I don't for a long time. So but they do inform, I feel like they really do inform each other. It's kind of like, I don't want to say like surreal, but that's just the word that's coming to me right now. Um, I'm able to kind of like excavate information from drawing and apply them into sculpture making. I feel like, you know, this vignette here, like I feel like I drew this before. And if anything, the drawing too, you have to think about space in a way that like you have to create space on a two-dimensional plane. And I think that has also translated over to making sculpture, like something as simple as like that horizon line and the kind of molding in this image, and then having the flooring and having this concept of like you middle ground, background, and foreground. Like you have to work those things out on a two-dimensional plane. I think that information is carried over into like sculpture making and just like thinking about space and kind of like creating like context around work. I feel like all of that stuff, it mingles with each other and meshes in there and creates something, you know, something like this per se.
Something like this. Yeah, this is pretty cool. I didn't notice the door until I was on my way out. I passed through without thinking, without frankly paying, I guess, enough attention to come into this room. And Chloe, I don't know if you could zoom out just for once more so everybody can see who hasn't been to the show, is green on all four walls. And yeah, the wooden door is really apparent in that photo. Thanks, that's a great choice. So yeah, I liked the handle. I thought was the doorknob. I really, well, I guess let me say one of the things I really liked about the doorknob was that it wasn't functional versus the clock, which I loved that it was functional and or functional in a way. Certainly, it's not telling time, but it's active and I liked that the door handle and the doorknob, it wasn't. But before we get to that, I would really just love to hear you talk about how you made the choice for this green, this room. One of the things that I think is really appealing about your work is the way that you arrange it. And this was something that caught my eye at the Whitney Biennial, frankly, which was an exhibition that, I mean, it could have been like the curators took their idea from visiting this show. I say really, it's over, because this sort of open, this open format. I assume you got to see it, but maybe not. That's how the exhibition was organized. And when I came around your piece, I just was like, wow, this thing has this organization has all the gravity and all the same thoughtfulness of how the pieces fit together. So I guess coming back, two questions. I would love to hear you talk about how you made the choices for the floor, the door, and the green walls. And then I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about placing these objects the way that you do.
When you're asking this, I think like the first thing that comes to mind is just like, like sculpture is like a bodily experience, right? So like how your body moves through space, how it moves around a piece, like it like really involves you kind of being in relation to another object or a thing. And I think that's like a really powerful like thing that sculpture is able to do, because in order to see different things or to like understand different like components of an object, you kind of have to negotiate your body. So that's something like I caught on to, or like, just like really felt with looking at work and just noticing how, how you place things in a room could orchestrate how your body moves around the room. I feel like whenever I'm making the sculpture, like I'm always stepping back, I'm always walking around the sculpture. So thinking about the three-dimensionality of the object and the thing, I think that's very important, like in the creation of the work. And it's just like when I'm placing the work, I'm thinking about this stuff too. It's just like, how does my body move around these shapes? So it's like a lot of it is just like really kind of like formal thinking too. It's just like having contrast, having things that you can't see through, having things that you can see through, having things that are high, having things that are tall. I feel like, the components in the show, like the calendar and the clock and like the little wall elements, and I imagine it without those things, it would be a completely entirely different work. Like looking at this stuff on a 2D screen, it's just like thinking about how your eye kind of like moves around. So I feel like these are things that I think about when I'm placing the work. And when I'm also making the work and thinking about sculpture, I'm thinking about how, sculpture has the potential to force your body to move around space. I feel like music, it is incredible because it forces your body to move, like, and it does that anywhere. You don't have to be in front of in front of a thing to like experience music. But I think that is just like a powerful thing when you're interacting with something, and it literally forces your body to move, or you can't help but to move and get into the rhythm of whatever it is. So I think that is like one of the things that I hold on to when thinking about um, placing sculpture and making sculpture. And like for me, I think like there are a lot of subtle things that like I'm doing that kind of help to give the work as much context as possible. So it's just like this show would have been an entirely different show if it were just these objects on a cement floor with like white walls. It wouldn't have this kind of like context into it. And all that information just comes from drawing and painting and like working out these things on a 2D surface. Um, the color of the wall came from a Grant Green album cover, Solid, and the name of the show, Maybe Tomorrow, is named after a Grant Green song that is also a sample in a Kendrick Lamar song called Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst. So it's just like that kind of like guitar riff and like that almost like melody, and that it's almost like melancholy, but like having like optimism at the same time. I loved how open-ended Maybe Tomorrow sounded, because sometimes like it could be good news or it could be bad news. It's like however you want to take it. And I feel like this like whole idea of just like holding on to like a better tomorrow is like, and just having optimism is also like something that I hope comes across like in the work. I think it comes across in like some of the titles, and just like yeah, having hope no matter what the circumstances are. And I think that's also like the kind of like function of humor in the work. I feel like humor makes it a little bit easier to kind of like go through things that are a little bit hard. I feel like comedians talk about or make light out of like situations that are a little bit difficult and tough. I feel like if we didn't have humor, I feel like if I didn't have humor in my life, I would just walk around pissed off all the time. So I feel like I don't want to do that. So I'm trying to like put that energy, into the work, and it's like completely like I'm like happy when people look at the work and they kind of like have these like feelings of happiness and joy and laughter, and there's also space for other emotions to exist in the pieces and objects as well, because both things can be true. um yeah.
Yeah, no, I really, it's great to hear you talk about that, and I super agree with everything you've been saying. And as you were talking about a body moving in space, and I was thinking about my experience of having my body move through this room, and how many different sight lines there were for all the different works, and how the different works it necessarily interact with one another, um, in an environment that you've created. I mean, and I'm looking at this image here, and I'm kind of chuckling that the photographer must have had a smile when they framed your light switch right,
Yeah, exactly. I
smack in the
just saw that
center.
too.
It's like it's there's a lot of. I remember I don't know, Cliff, if there's the screen, if there's a view. This is a great one. I was going to ask that if we could, if there's a picture that showed, the bottom. Yeah, that's great. But I wanted to show the see-through of the this next picture down, where you could see through the. Yes, thanks. Yes, bingo.
you know so that's
Sorry, you
another
wanted to
thing
say
with,
something, Woody?
yeah, just thinking about like the nature of like sculpture, the nature of ceramics. Like it's a very like opaque material, and it's like kind of like very kind of like stable and like very kind of like static. So it's just like when making stuff, it's just like how do you allow for some contradiction to happen there, and
Mm.
how are you able, and it's something as simple as like opening up the center of this so you're able to see through the object, and it's not this thing that completely obstructs what's going on in front and behind it. And I think like that kind of like orchestrates itself and in an installation as well. I think like some of the decisions with like choosing objects like the step ladder is like one of those reasons. It's like I chose the step ladder. One, I think it's like a positive object. It's about up, it's a tool to help you get up. And I just love that as like a metaphor. It helps you access things that you haven't been able to access before. But as an object, I thought it offered so much in the context of like thinking about it with other work. Because you're able to see through certain parts of the object, and it reveals what's going on behind it.
Well, and that brings up another interesting aspect of the work that you're making is the interiority and the exterior. And this was something that became more significant in my thinking when I got to the Metropolitan and I saw a whole lot of vessels that were really made to be containers. And then I came back to thinking about your pieces, and I never really, when I was there initially, I didn't think of them that way. And then I came back and looked again, and it seemed like there is insides and there are outsides, and then there's aspects where you can see through, and places where your vision is obscured. And these types of balances seem necessary, one, for a good work, but also like they could resonate in all manner of philosophical or metaphysical ways, that maybe you don't have to think about when you're making them, but perhaps you do. And I'm curious, like if those are things you think about when you're working, or things that you reflect on after you've stopped.
I mean, this is one of those things where we were talking about pace and like
Yeah.
kind of like the rhythm of thing before that I have to kind of like go back to. It's just like, I've done exhibitions and shows where all the work is, you can't see through anything. And, it's just like, that creates a very specific type of like energy and vibe. So it's just like, I feel like now I'm starting to get to a point where, I'm still experimenting, and I'm always going to experiment. But I'm starting to get to a point where I have like, and this also goes back to what we're saying too, like that intuition as well, where it's just like there's enough information there for me to make these like distinctions about what I want the work to feel like, or how I want the exhibition to feel. I guess like to answer is just like at the onset, like no, I probably wasn't aware of it, but like now I'm becoming more acutely aware of kind of like working in these contradictions, and just really honing in on that. I feel like it's also kind of like just a part of like my personal philosophy. I'm a Gemini, so I'm always doing the other thing, and I think that is just like, it just goes back and forth. It's just like, if I see myself doing something too much and I have the foresight to take a step back, I'm like, what else can I introduce to kind of differentiate this or add some complexity to what's going on?
Absolutely. And as Chloe flips through, there's so many things that occur to me that I want to ask you. I guess first I want to talk about animals. And Chloe was flipping through. We all got a chance to see some birds, some dogs. Tell me about, how do you get inspired? How do you choose the animals that you choose? And what do they, what do they, how do you put them together? Like, why birds and dogs?
I mean, to be like honest with this sculpture, this is a sculpture in the likeness of my dog, Mia. And like my dog has changed my life. I think dogs are just like life-changing like creatures. They're so incredibly giving and special and just like sweet and awesome. It's just like, I feel like, my dog has definitely eased and cushioned the blow of what the current like political, economical, like social situation is. And like my dog gets me outside every day, whether I like it or not. You know, I feel like before I got her, there were stretches of time where I wouldn't go outside at all. And that does something to your like spiritual well-being. You know, the sun is like necessary for us to be alive. If we don't get the sun, like it affects our mood, it affects our well-being. So, you know, my dog, she gets me outside every day. She gets me on hikes. Like she's just been such an incredible facet of in addition to like, you know, my spiritual and mental well-being. And like, you know, she's actually the one who got me looking into birds, because she always looks up and she looks so adorable when she looks up at these little birds. So I started like referencing the birds a lot more. The first one I made was included in the presentation at the Whitney, but I think like you know, I think like the practice I feel like is wanting to open up, and there are inclinations of like including the outside a little bit more. I feel like the calendar painting kind of like alluded to that. Just being outside and being able to enjoy like the natural resources we have out here in the Bay Area, like having just like incredible hiking, like 15-20 minutes away, like that has just done so much for my own personal well-being. It's just naturally finding ways into the work. And it's like another one of those things like that I haven't like thought about it like too much, but as like things, as I'm able to take a step back, like there's like this image in this like book, that studio book called Power, or a book that I have in the studio called Power Figures. And it's about, you know, the artistic customs and rituals of the Bantu kingdom. And it goes through certain specific like tribes in that region. But there's an image of a dog in this like seated position. I feel like I've also seen images of like at the Met, Egyptian wing, and they have like their cats and dogs kind of like in these
Yeah.
like regal
Yeah.
poses. I'm just like, you know what? I need one of those for my
Yeah.
dog. But there's
Yeah.
this history, and there's a lot of like already a lot of information and visual information, a lot of sculptural visual information on different animals and different like components of the natural life.
It's really encouraging to hear you say that. I similarly was inspired by my dog to look at nature. I also had help of the pandemic to shut down my opportunities to go see the paintings and sculptures that I had grown accustomed to looking at. I found myself in a situation where there was more trees and birds. And
Yeah.
I wound up taking a lot more pleasure than I expected learning about them and giving them my attention. And it's quite special. And as you were talking, you know, and thinking about influences, and I was thinking about California, I was also thinking about the long history of sculptors and ceramicists, particularly, you know, that area has, you know, people like Rod Nagel, Peter Volkos, Viola Frey, and I'm curious, like, if their influence has much draw for you, or if it had at an earlier phase of your making process, or just if you feel that legacy out in the geography that is your home.
Yeah, I mean, there's like no way to not feel the legacy out here, because like, you know, you go to the airport, that the San Francisco airport has a huge, at one of the wings terminals, they have like a huge Viola Fry like ceramic tiled piece. I feel like at the entrance of the Oakland Museum for the longest, they had a also massive Viola Fry. Like where I went to school, the CCA, the Oakland campus, the ceramics facilities was designed by her. So there's like kind of like no way to not feel the influence here. I feel like, you know, a couple years ago I was able to visit Peter Volkas's studio, like the place where I work with for like some bronze production. They also have a ton of Peter Volkas's just like hanging out there. So the influence and like the history is there. And I think like early on, like learning about like ceramics, there was a lot of like of this like gravitational pull. Like there was just like a lot of like really interesting, like amazing like ceramic work being made in California. In undergrad, I used to go to this conference in Sika, and they had a student juried exhibition, and all the work that like I liked at the student juried exhibition was coming out of California, specifically CCA, the school I went to
Interesting.
for graduate school. So there's this kind of like innate pool and like super early interest, but like I think now it's like it's shifted a lot for me, where I'm finding a lot more examples from more like I guess historic, not, I don't want to say, because those works are historical, but like more of like potentially like ancestral references. I feel like I'm like in this phase now where I'm like really trying to know my past in this way, kind of like outside of the gaze, or at least attempting to do it outside of the gaze of like colonialism. So like looking at like, you know, African religion and looking at these different customs of like African sculpture. I've been really interested in like Yoruba and that type of like mythology. And I think, a lot of the newer forms are being like influenced more by this kind of like re-education going on for me.
Hmm. I was wondering if there was some of that influence in one of the pedestals. These are all very basic ones, but there was one that had a more geometric, like stacked cones.
Yeah. So I am
This
looking at that
down
too.
a little lower, Chloe, lower. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, so that comes out of like, that's just like a reference to a drum, and like in doing some reading and like some investigation, like there's this book that I had, my friend just gave to me. He's like, I think you'd like this. It's called As Serious as Your Life. It's about the free jazz movement. And there's a section in there that's called Give the Drummer Some. And they talk about the drum as being like this like Afro-futuristic like instrument, right? And like they talked about, the drum being banished from slave quarters because they thought it would give them power and like incite them to riot. So I thought that was like just like a very like incredible like reference. I grew up Catholic, but both of my parents are from Haiti, and I just remember going to church. It wasn't like the traditional Catholicism that you see on TV, but there were like these like instruments, like an African drum. Like, and I was like, that's very cool that I'm making that distinction now, but like reading that antidote, and seeing how like, the shape is also like I think it's like an art historical shape too. I feel like I've seen images of like Brancusi's studio and like,
Mancusi, yeah,
yeah, having shapes like
exactly.
that, and Noguchi having shapes like that. So it's just like, pulling those things along the line, but like I don't know, just like a homage to that instrument and like that form. It's like a beautiful, like iconic form. I actually have like a huge like chunk of wood that I'm gonna try and carve in a similar shape. But it's just like I'm like looking at these things and embodying them and holding on to them. But the idea of like the drum being like this powerful instrument, I feel like, it just holds a lot of like magnetism to it.
And it becomes totemic, the way you've got it
Yeah.
stacked in this fashion. It adds a whole other sense of power to it. And then I think this is a great sculpture to hold on to for a second, because it contains a lot of those like very deep and quite serious references, your history, art history, Western sculpture history, and yet like on top is sort of a lamp, with and it's funny, and I found, like I can't help but smile when I am around this figure, and I find that like this is a great example of a balance between playfulness and like frankly tremendous depth. But since we are starting to talk a little bit about pieces of the past, I think maybe, Chloe, it would be a great opportunity to switch over to the image that we have from Hear Me Now, the show that you're included in at the Metropolitan Museum, along with Simone Lee, Theaster Gates, some really tremendous artists. I wasn't really familiar with this history, and I found it really powerfully moving. Would you mind just giving a little bit of a talk about these face jugs, sort of how they came into your attention, and how they've influenced your work, maybe what you feel about being included in the show alongside them? Yeah.
I mean, I feel like this is something that like I'm like still actively like processing, because like to be put into like that context of like history is like really, it's like I don't have words to kind of like describe it. Like I feel honored. I feel like super privileged. I feel like, I don't know, just like extremely blessed to have been included in kind of like this to be included in this show, and to be included with like this like history of like these radical like objects. Yeah, it's just kind of like insane. I first came aware of these images from an artist, Jim McDowell. He has a video on YouTube that I keep coming back to, because he describes the tradition of these like jugs so brilliantly. But it's like these face jugs are these things that enslaved people brought from their home, and like continue that tradition here. So I think they're just like, yeah, it's just like incredible. And then, like, as I'm doing more of this like investigation and like trying to kind of like uncover my past, in a way, these have always been like, a point for me to come back to. Yeah, just in just in how they're created, but also kind of like, this kind of like spiritual meaning behind them. I feel like I look at something like this and the eyes are like wide open, like seeing everything that's around them. The face also has this like grimace to ward off like negative energy. And I feel like that type of like, spirituality, and that type of aspect of imbuing objects with like this intense emotion, and kind of like this kind of like protective quality, like that's something that I have been intentionally trying to put into the sculptures, like channeling the sculptures with that type of like spirituality and emotion, and like knowing that, objects and the things around us, like they're not just there for our use, but there's like this relationship that we have with them, with our environment, with the things going on in our space. And I feel like these objects kind of like call attention to that.
I've got goosebumps listening to you speak about them. It was really quite moving. And one of the things that I thought about when I was there was that a lot of I think the deep power that these objects held came out of the energy that they were charged with, and the various rituals that they were used for. I don't know what those were, but I think about the deeply moving moments in my life or the lives of others where there were objects that took on ceremonial power. I think about the paintbrushes of a painter. I think about the guitar of a guitar player. I think about how these objects get charged with the energy that gives them something out of the language's ability to say, but it gives them a force, but it's a force that comes through use. The guitar player's guitar, once it's just sitting in the museum, starts losing that.
It becomes something different. Yeah.
It becomes something different. The use that humans put into it, that these pieces, they were crafted with such special symbolic power, and then the symbolic power was reinforced by these events in which these objects were meaningful parts of a process. And of course, that's not something that we expect of contemporary art, or do we really have many modes or systems set up to engage or acknowledge that type of energy or relationship? I was really moved a little when I was thinking about you beginning a lot of your sculptural practice by taking the objects and doing something with them. And I suspect that they became charged with something more once they had been to the bodega or been to the barbershop, had their haircut or not. And yeah, so I guess my question back is like, do you agree with that? Do you disagree? And if, how do you think about adding that kind of energy or creating opportunities to add that sort of energy to the pieces that you make?
That's something that like I've learned, and just like the little bit of research I've been doing or investigation that I've been doing on these type of objects or like Nikiski figures, and like understanding that like the context that we see them now, like they are actually like debunked of like that power, like I feel like a lot of the Nikiski figures were activated by a bilongo, which is like some type of medicinal concoction that was like imbued in the sculpture, and that's what activated the sculpture. They were activated during ceremonies. All of like the nails being driven into the sculpture were like these like tools and instruments used to kind of like in ceremonial process, but also used to like heal and like aid different like tribal and social ailments. I look at some of these like wood sculptures of like the ones that are more aggressive with like shaft and spears that are more kind of like meant for I guess like more like democracy or like kind of like tribal or like some type of like they're like protective spirits versus the ones that are like holding their bellies or holding their breasts that are meant for like healing or and more pertaining to like fertility issues. Just like understanding the different functionalities and like realizing like these objects weren't just made for like our gaze. They were like made because like they served an actual like purpose. And I think like I'm still like contextualizing like how I'm trying to imbue the objects with kind of like this type of function. But I think the function happens in conversation and the emotions and feelings that get brought up in the sculptures, and kind of like just like opening up I just feel like a lot of the objects have like these positive undertones or like these reminders to like keep going. Like that sculpture on the kind of like drum bass, the title of it is like "Keep the Light On," and it's just like, yeah, like it has so many different like metaphorical meanings. But I think this is just like literally like a positive omen, or trying to like will some positivity into like the space with an object like this. The piece on the ladder is kind of like sitting in a meditative stance, and it has like these tools that are meant for work, but it also has these tools that are meant for leisure, and finding a balance between both. One of the light switches like keep going, that's the title of it. It's just like that's all that we could do. Like I feel like if anything, like I'm just trying to put the objects do hold a lot of like the more kind of like cumbersome emotions that may come up, but it's also a reminder for us to kind of like push through and try and like find solutions and try and like move along. I feel like I reference like phones a lot because like a lot of times like it's as simple as just like speaking to our true emotional self, right? Instead of like holding that thing in your gut, holding that thing in your heart, like talk to somebody about it. The phones are a reminder of that. I feel like all of the references of like clocks and like the calendars now and like the plants in the future are just like these like reminders that like we're on finite time. Like you know what I'm saying? It's just like what is the intention for our days and how we want to proceed. So I feel like in that sense, like I feel like that is kind of like the activation that I'm hoping that these objects like offer up, and in the exchange that happens when somebody is in the space. This thing references a rib cage, and that's a reminder to keep breathing. I feel like I learned this word from this book I mentioned a little while ago, Power Figures, and the word is muhihi, and it's just like a Bantu word for like breath, for life force, for wind, and for like kind of acknowledging like that is its own special thing in and of itself. And I think that manifests in my work through like, you know, an object like a vent, or like an object like the radiator, or like other objects like the box fans and the AC units. So yeah, I mean, that's at its core, like that is like what I'm trying to put into the work, whether it like lands or not, like, you know, that's beyond my control, but you know, we could only do the best that we can, right?
Yeah, no, that's it. To hope or to expect for more, it would be uh, that would be perhaps putting oneself behind the wrong ball. Woody, I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It's really been an incredible pleasure for me, and I'm going to turn it back over to Chloe to field a Q&A from our audience. Thank you, Woody.
Thank you so much, Woody, and thank you, Charlie, for that incredible conversation about the work. We do have a few audience questions, and the first one is going to be from GE. I encourage you, if you have a question, to post it in the chat, and we'll be sure to come around to you as well.
Thank you so much, Chloe, Charlie, and Woody, and thank you, Woody, for bringing forth, in a sense, the spirit of Grant Green too. So thank you for that. But my question is, in using clay as your primary medium, can you speak about, and I think you kind of did, but can you speak about how you fuse innovation with reverence?
Um, I have no clue. I feel like clay just kind of makes sense to me on a kind of like primal level. Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm still making sense of like how all the references like exist together in a piece. Like I think that's something that you can't really think about too much. You kind of just like need to let happen. I feel like a lot of times when I am in the studio, it's a matter of like, how do I just like turn the switch off to let something else happen? And you know, I think all of the things going on happen when that filtration is like turned off. I feel like I'm also very intentional about the type of like things that I'm intaking in terms of like information and like images. You know, I'm not the biggest fan of like Instagram and being online because like I feel like my mind is just like functions at a different frequency. And I feel like when I'm very serious about being in the studio and making art, that's when I go through like a little bit of a digital detox and just take time off of those things. I feel like I do wish I had like more time to read more in depth. Like I feel like the things that I do read, I read chapters at a time, I read little nuggets at a time. I feel like sometimes when I'm in the studio, I'll just like pick something up and I'll just read a chapter. Like yesterday, I was reading Aesthetics of Cool, and it's just this Robert Ferris Thompson book. And he has chapters with like John Coltrane. He has chapters on like the tap tap buses in Haiti. I was reading about like David Hammond's in this book, and there's just like little nuggets of like things kind of like feeding into the work. So I feel like that type of thing happens when you're not thinking too much and you're just letting the thing kind of like flow out of you in a way. But I think there are parameters around the type of like stuff that goes into you that then goes into the work.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
And you know, jazz has been a huge part of my life. More recently, I felt like the pandemic gave me a lot of time to really like fall in love with jazz, and like I feel like a lot of that kind of like ethos, like reading about like Sun Ra and the type of like regimented practice that they had, and like, you know, the lifestyle that they live, like Miles Davis and his band, like he was very strict on them and just like practicing and being able to show up. So I think those things kind of like go into the work too. Like I think a lot about like how do I show up to make art, and how am I respectful for the gift that I have of making art. So it's like simple things of like trying to get as much sleep as I can, like bringing food into the studio so I have the nourishment to do what I need to do, like just taking care of my body so I could then take care of what the sculpture and the work needs me to take care of. So I feel like it's really like this like holistic branch, and everything kind of like feeds into the kind of like the soil of the work, and like the foundation that it's able to sprout and grow.
Oh, I get that. It's showing up for the recording date and being prepared.
Yeah, for real.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, GE. Woody, the next question is going to be from me. I was wondering if you could speak, you've touched on this in the conversation, to how you go about thinking about scale when you make each individual work, because I feel like scale plays a part in the stories each of these objects have, not just in relationship to one another, but in relationship to you, or in relationship to how you're approaching them. And I was curious, how do you think about that when you're sitting down to make a new work, about size, about how that alludes to a certain memory or story?
I feel like I think about it like all together, like as a group. Sometimes like some work kind of calls for it to be at a higher like level, but like with this show I was just thinking about like balance, and how the work, there are already some larger pieces and some like shorter pieces. I feel like that sculpture keeping the light on with the two drums kind of came out of like just like thinking about like, how does the space feel balanced. There are also like kind of like parameters of the kilns that I'm like starting to work against. Like my kilns are only a certain size, and like I can only make something a certain height. And I think that kind of like influenced the kind of like introduction of like the bronze and the ceramics together, and then also influenced the introduction of the wood pieces, because it gives me more flexibility to play around with range and scale. In terms of like kind of like the individual objects, I feel like like that part is like, I don't want to rely on like intuition as like the answer, but like I've made remotes that have been like actual handheld size, and I've made stuff that has been bigger. So sometimes like, with the latter pieces, like the scale of the objects needed to be appropriate for the scale of the ladder. I feel like the earlier phones that I've made were just like calling attention to kind of like this urgency to kind of communicate, and to feel like you have space to be heard, and feel like you have space to actually like speak up. So I think there is some kind of like poetic gestures in that, but a lot of it is just like looking at the combination of objects together in the studio. And again, it's just like kind of like a formal way of thinking about it, but it's just like, how do you create balance in the selection of things going on?
Thank you. The last question is going to be from the Rails artistic director and publisher, Phong Bui.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Woody, Charlie. I was going to ask the question in regard to scale, Woody, but I think you kind of answered for me, but I just want to add it a little bit more to it, because in the show, the way that the works predicate their distinctive holding its space for themselves in a way, while individually affirming their individuality for sure. They also carry an intimate dialogue as a whole with each other, So the term that I can think of at the moment is a-perception or apperception. It's a very interesting term that was used in psychology, means evoking the process by which new experience is the result of the residuum of past experience in order to form a new unified experience, right? in philosophy, since I'm reading a lot of Kant recently, Immanuel Kant refer it as a transcendental apperception, a form in a way referred to the potential or possible unity of coherent consciousness out of different elementary inner experiences in regard to, say, the notion of passing of time. So passing of time is so interesting to me, looking in this very, very intonation. I can't help but to think of scale, which you kind of answered already, because there's a slight manipulation of scale, because none of them seem to be what they ought to be in real life proportion. You know, everything is bigger or smaller, and they kind of put it together. But the question is, you know, in about 67, 68, Philip Guston abandoned lyrical abstraction altogether and began imagery, you know, and he would undertake this so-called alphabetical painting, or painting of single object, a clock, a book, a cup, a table, you know, and whatnot. And then he will bring them all together, you know, and had that infamous show at the Winter at Marlborough Gallery in 1970, which legendary now. So my question in regard to a perception and in regard to also the alphabet and your own reading of Guston, because I think looking at the show now, the objects are created as I just described, but they belong to interior space. You know, it's not quite a studio context like the way Guston would often paint in his painting, you know, but there are relationships there. So my first question, maybe too many questions here, so to describe what I want to ask you.
No, I think I'm starting to get the gist of what you're saying. And like, you know, I feel like a couple of things came up, right? I feel like objects like hold a lot of power, like more power than, you know, I think we take it for granted. You know, I feel like, you know, I think about Guston and like those cups and those shoes and like the nails and what they symbolize. They're loaded. Like a nail for me, and seeing those nails kind of like reminded me of these like African sculptures with all the nails driven into it. You know, if you're spiritual, or like, I mean, I grew up Catholic, so you always think about, you know, Jesus on the cross and the nails piercing through. So I feel like even though the objects are like very like simple and mundane, they're very loaded. I feel like, you know, Robert Gover is another person who really kind of like meditates on like these kind of like very specific objects, and just like, you know, when you kind of like change the size of them, and you play with the scale, and you play with the presentation of them, it remixes your own kind of like association with that. And if I feel like it forces you to think about your relationship with that object in a different light. And I think that is like one of the most powerful things about like Gober's work. Is just like they kind of like transcend like a metaphysical plane and become something like spiritual. And there are also these like, I feel like these homages to like everyday life. You know, I feel like I've also been doing some investigation on just like, you know, African burial like customs. And I took a trip to New Orleans a couple years ago, and then, you know, there's a podcast that I listened to about how, you know, these I forget, they were like immigrating from one country, but they were getting lost at sea and dying at sea, and they would land somewhere else. And this man, he would go back to their country of origin with only their objects to help identify the bodies of the people. So it was like things like clothing and shoes that were very particular and distinct to the person owning them. I feel like there is a custom that I feel like I read in Flash of the Spirit that was also reiterated in this other book of Water and Spirit, about like just like these mourning rituals, about how, you know, oftentimes when somebody has just died, like their seat at the table was left the same because it still carry their their energy, and they didn't want the spirits to feel like they were abandoned. A lot of times with the funeral and like the burial process, like people would bring objects that the person and like used and enjoyed to their burial site. And then you think about, you know, the whole tradition of Egyptians, like they were buried with all of their belongings and things. So I feel like, you know, objects do, I mean, you know, I wouldn't go as far off to say just like the things that we use, we have this like spiritual energy that gets imbued with them, and they hold a lot of information. You know, for me, I feel like the cups, like I reference a lot because there are a lot of like art historical references, but like, you know, a cup is also like, to me, symbolizes you woke up today and how you're going to drink coffee, and how, you know, like that is like, it's like special, you know, that is just, it's not just a cup, it's a cup that's also celebrating another day, a new day. And I feel like too, like, you know, there's certain things that like certain like tools and stuff that I'm starting to reference more that have this like art historical reference, but like there's this other book that I'm reading about, or I go back to, about the Yoruba deities, and you know, a lot of the deities have different objects that symbolize their presence, you know. So I'm thinking about the deity Algun, who's like supposed to be this enforcer, and you know, a lot of like things like silver or iron are like incarnations of this deity. So I'm like realizing that, you know, and becoming more acute and attuned to the kind of different like spiritual aspects that go into the things that we live with. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but those are the things that just came to
No,
mind.
I think you answered it very clearly, Woody, because it is that awareness for us being artists. So there's a you know, the memory of art historical knowledge. You articulate well with mentioning Bob Goldberg for a good example. You know, being gay, growing up in as a Catholic, growing up in the suburb, all of that is loaded into the way that he modified his slight disproportion or playing with scale with the, you know, whether the sing or the 2 feet with the shoe coming up from the floor, stuck to the wall and whatnot. Many different images that he have, I mean, brilliantly, you know, deployed really through the work as iconography for sure.
Yeah.
But you know, my last question is interval. So now we deal with scale, proportion, and whatnot. Interval is interesting because it's what hold all these objects in the space. You know, we talk about their individual assertion, you know, but there's an interval between, the space in between is what makes the installation. I mean, Charlie and you have kind of talked about it, but I wanted to further a little bit here because Thelonious Monk once famously say, there's no such a thing as a wrong note. It's very important to put in that context because it seems to me that you can't really single out a piece in the intonation and say this is more successful than the other.
You know, you cannot. I feel like people have asked me what my favorite piece were. I'm like, that is an impossible for me to that's an impossible question to answer, because I feel like they all needed each other, and they came out in a specific time where a specific span of time where they're all interrelated and they all kind of add to the power of each other. I feel like yeah, I don't know. I think that is very true. Like there is no hierarchy in the objects. Everything is equally as important.
Yes. They sing in unison. Hello.
Yeah.
It's a title of our show currently, which I can't wait to bring you up to see it, Woody. It's a congratulations on a fantastic show. And I thank you for coming on to our NSE, talking to Charlie. And now we just have to make sure everyone who's tuning in now, once we put on YouTube, it will hopefully inspire more people to come see the show. Back to you, Chloe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bong. And thank you, Woody, again for today's conversation. And thank you, Charlie. It's now my pleasure to introduce our poet laureate of the day, Raevan Aliyah Sr., and welcome her to the stage. New York City bred creative director, singer, songwriter, and multifaceted creative Raevan Aliyah Sr. enjoys writing poems about relationships, love, and race relations. Born to a Jamaican father who wrote several 80s songs and authored multiple poetry books, let's just say it's in her blood. Welcome, Raevan.
Thank you. There's some construction happening outside, so you guys might hear a weird noise. I can't get away from it. I'm sorry. So I'm gonna read one really long poem. Not really, really long, but called Continuous Pondering Thoughts. So here it goes. Okay. I tried to dust you off as an insignificant character, but year after year I recycle you, recurring character you are, and for whatever reason, I don't ever let you go too far. I don't know why. Is there that much comfort and familiarity? Is all I know pain and disappointment that I run back to it? Am I comfortable in this place that I no longer want to be, or continuous pondering thoughts? Who am I without these attachments? Is it healthier to let go or cut off completely, or to reserve some tidbits of our relationship that is forever changed? I've been hurt to my soul and have this theory that everyone who loves you and who you love will hurt you. Like, think about it. My mom has hurt me. My friends have hurt me. My lovers have hurt me. That's just a constant state. Is this ideal relationship free from pain? I used to think so, but that seems more and more like a fantasy. They say success is not linear, but neither is love or relationships. Is my person someone who challenges me to grow in a way other than what I consider healthy support to be my best? Are they challenging my thoughts on trust, love, on everything? Are they really here to challenge my ideas on it all? Whoever really depicts what a long-lasting relationship actually looks like. From what I see, every old couple who've been together for millions of years have had a cheating scandal, took a break, had moments where they thought there was no return. Continuous pondering thoughts. My friend Melissa and I always talk about a concept where we call it a memory chokehold. You're driving or walking and you see a spot where they held your hand for the first time, or a club where you guys almost beat down a drunk guy who grabbed your ass, and you long for those moments back, but you can never return. Oh, nostalgia, the grip is too tight. Continuous pondering thoughts. Time and time again on my journey, it becomes more and more necessary and apparent that my relationship to me is most important. I try to be kind and loving and give myself grace for not being perfect, but solitude is becoming a larger and larger theme. Growing pains, oh, how it hurts. Superpopulated city where everyone feels so alone. Temporary relief from another temporary relationship, but a forever love. Continuous pondering thoughts. Love to me is only real if it doesn't turn off like a night switch. I always say that my love is like Suge Knight's mentality, like the only way out is in a body bag. I will love you forever, whether that's from afar or up close and personal. Continuous pondering thoughts. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raevan. That was amazing. And thank you again, Woody and Charlie. And thank you to the team at Karma for helping prepare in advance of today's conversation. We'd also, of course, like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring today's NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You'll be able to view today's event and our full archive on the Rail's YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like on our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the writers, editors, and operations at the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Joe Bradley, hosted by Terry Myers on the occasion of New Paltz at Xavier Hufkins. We conclude with a poetry reading by Greg Masters. And thank you again for joining us today. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave.
Bye. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you,
guys for
Woody.
having
Thank
me.
you, Charlie. Thank you, Raevan.
Thank you
Thanks for
all.
that great poem,
Thank you,
Raven.
everyone.
Always.
Have a great day, Woody.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Woody.
Congrats.
Thank you, Raven, for the beautiful
Hey,
reading.
Andromeda. Good to see you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Charlie.
So much.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks,
Hey,
everyone. Bye.
Nikki, congrats. Go see the show. Good to see you
Have
then.
a good
Nikki.
weekend, everyone.
Yeah, have a great
You too,
weekend
Charlie.
to all. Haji.
Hey, man.